Hi, my name is Christopher Law. Today, I'm going to be discussing the lateral raise for the final and motor learning. The lateral raise is not a performance dominant movement, so you will not get tons of performance feedback from it. However, the movement itself does carry over to aesthetics. It helps support the shoulder girdle. It helps support the shoulder as a whole. And when you look at somebody that's an athlete and you see very round shoulders, commonly it is the lateral head that is very developed. This muscle can also play into endurance feats. It can help with lateral movement if you're a football player. It can help with the ripping of a football of a tackler. It can help with shedding tackles. It can help give you that cushion to when you do get tackled. So for the movement itself, I'm going to go ahead and grab these 3-pound dumbbells that I have over here. I'm going to go ahead and showcase it for you first. The lateral raise, 3-pound dumbbells right here. Go out to the side. Back down, back to the side, back down. From the side, the movement. Performance markers and where you would see an increase in an athlete would be, can they utilize more weight? Do they have better form? Do they have better proprioception? Proprioception is going to be key for the lateral raise, and that a lot of athletes, they like to, with the thumbs up, do the lateral raise, opening in somewhat of a Y formation with their body. The reality is we want athletes to be pinned, for the most part, at the hip. I'm going to go to the side here. So we want them at the hip. I'll grab that 3-pound dumbbell again. We want them at the hip with their elbow and their wrist parallel to the floor. We want the knuckles to be facing the floor as well. If I show you the other demonstration, this movement is now suddenly a different movement. And why is that? Well, the movement focuses heavily on the front delts. It also brings into back musculature that is not where we want to target necessarily. When we're looking at whole body movement, sure. But if we're looking at the lateral raise itself for aesthetic purposes and just trying to put mass on those lateral heads, we want to focus on trying to isolate the muscle as much as possible. We understand the forearm right here, as well as the biceps, the triceps are going to get some supporting love in the movement. Why is that? Because they're essentially holding the weight, which is the beginning of the movement. We grab the weights and we get into a position. For the most part, we want to put the scapula decompressed down, and we want our scapula to remain neutral for the most part. We also understand the traps are going to get some love, and some of the upper back muscles are going to be supporting as well. The triceps, the deltoids can't be fully isolated. So when I say that, the front delt and the rear delt, also the anterior and the posterior delts, will get some play in the movement. So when we're looking at this in the grand scheme of things, well, why would we just do something to the lateral head? Well, if we can cause the most amount of damage to the lateral head, that's going to enable us to put a lot of meat where that needs to be and a lot of supporting tissue where it needs to be. So we've just discussed the muscles used, the force of contraction. So we know that if I'm holding a dumbbell here and it's down to the side, this part right here is not super contractile. Okay, so not until we start to get away with gravity right about here, up to this point, do we know the concentric portion of the muscle is going to be stimulated at the most. So once we get up to here and any higher, depending on the athlete, we know this is the highest contractile range. Down in the eccentric, which is the negative portion, yes, the medial delt is stimulated. Things we have to be key on is a breakdown in form. When athletes aren't strong enough to do the movement in a GMP, they tend to shift their weights, and they'll shift the way they do things. And I will go ahead and demonstrate now. So we've discussed that this is the lateral raise. Athletes will start to shift the movement to the front of their body. They will also start to bend the elbows. The contractile range in that is a very different movement. you get more front delt, you also let other players come into factor. The traps will start to come into play the moment we start to change the way this movement goes. The upper back starts to come into play the more we utilize that. So the duration and the force of contraction. The force of contraction can be very strong depending on the tempo. So if I'm moving really fast, the force of contraction can be pretty severe in all reality, even though I'm moving fast. However, the breakdown of muscle tissue can be also equally as degrading if I go slow. An easy way to see how an athlete is weak is to have them do movement slow. So if I go slower, we're going to find out what supporting tissue or the tissue itself is actually weak or needs more love in terms of training. So when it comes to the duration, the lateral raise at a lighter weight can be done quite a bit. You can do it at very high rates due to the contexture of the deltoid muscles. With heavier weight, the duration is not near as long. So what we know is that the weight shifted over time, and the ability to lift heavier weights over time is far lower than that of lighter weight. I can go all day doing this. Bringing it back to proprioception, the awareness on this is even in higher reps and higher durations is to always keep that slight bend in the elbow, keep the wrist at a neutral plane, and keep the tension on the muscle the entire time for the prescribed duration or until mechanical failure. Mechanical failure, again, is when we start to bend the elbows a little bit more, we're starting to cheat, we're starting to use body English, we're starting to utilize other things. The motor skill for this is usually often butchered. Most people, they just move the weight from point A to point B. Bodybuilders have a great way of doing this because they're very conscious on how they position their wrist and how they position their body. There's no one right way to do this. However, there are optimal ways to do this. What we want to do is we want to try to find the most optimal pattern with that. The transfer to this, again, is we need to take our athlete and we need to put meat on the delts to take contact. Every sport, for the most part, has contact unless you're an individual sport, such as figure skating, or even in some physique sports. But even to that, you have aesthetics in which you need. The health of the shoulder is often dictated by how strong the tendons, how strong the muscles are, and how strong the ligaments are. If I have an athlete and they're utilizing bad form, I'm going to slow them down and have them start over. So we're going to focus on getting in a good straight motion. We're going to have them with their hands aside, slide bend to the elbow, and rigid wrists. We're then going to focus on keeping the elbow parallel as the first step. The internal reinforcer here is the athlete is conscious of their elbow position to the floor, as well as proprioception. The external factor is they can see their elbows in the mirror going up and down. The next is the wrist, because we do not want the thumb, we do not want to turn this into a different movement. We want to keep it on the side deltoid. The next would be the same thing. Wrist, keep them to the side, flat to the ground. If we look, my wrists are flat to the ground. This part of my knuckles, the open palm of my fist, is flat to the ground. Verbal cues would say good movement and continuous reinforcement of the reps. To some point, we don't have to cue as much for elbow positioning, wrist positioning, going too high, going too low. Punishment for this movement, there is no punishment factors. Simply taking the movement away is really obsolete. This isn't a movement that is overwhelming biomechanically, such as a squat, whereas some people with taller structures have biomechanical issues. So this movement can stay in most people's programs, and it should stay in most people's programs, in that regardless of how long your limbs are, this movement is common. So any sort of punishment or negative reinforcement, you don't want them to do more reps, because then you run the risk of injury. You don't want to injure the shoulder. It's already a fragile joint as it is with its whole internal structure. So we don't want to injure it anymore than what is already being damaged from the repetitions. So negative reinforcement is also something we would not use in this program. Overall, we discussed proprioception for the lateral raise. We discussed the variations in which a GMP would not cover, and how this could steer away from a common GMP or general motor program. We discussed the muscles used, primarily the medial delt, the overall delt as a whole, as well as the internal components of the deltoid are also in play. The force of contraction can be strong at a fast rate or a slow rate. The duration can be very low duration with heavier weights, or long duration for an endurance type event. The overall specific in terms of practice, we understand that the repetition is going to be key. People will develop a motor pattern or motor program based on repetitions. The transfer to sport is obviously aesthetic as well as support. Long-term health would be closer to the lateral raise than any direct performance. However, putting more mass on a muscle is a good thing. Overall, internal reinforcements are being very receptive and aware of where your body's at. In terms of doing movement externally, watching yourself do the movement has been the biggest and best cue for individuals attempting the lateral raise. Lastly, we do not use negative feedback, nor do we use any punishment utilizing the movement.